Discuss this further. Thanks and Happy New Year and good to see you again.
And you too. Thank you for having me.
So if we take a look at the pass rate for this year, finally broken through the 80 mark barrier, 81.3% was the pass rate for the class of 2019. But of that, we have below 40% of those candidates qualifying, at least for the National Senior Certificate exam, for a university entrance. What does that mean?
Well, I think that's where we need to start looking at the real rate of achievement of our students, because pass rate is creating a culture of pass, and that pass in itself is a very low standard. It's probably lower from a pass rate point of view in South Africa than it is in any other African country, which means that even though we're celebrating a very high retention rate, we actually aren't seeing that is of a high benchmark, and certainly not of a high enough benchmark for our students to be able to go into tertiary education and then onwards into job readiness. So if you start taking the real pass rates, so we're looking at dropout rates included in that from grade 1 to matriculation, then you start looking at, of our cohort this year of government schools, it was probably closer to 1 in 5 that are actually able to go on to be eligible for tertiary education. Now take into account that in the first year of university, 40% of our students drop out because even those students coming into the universities are not properly prepared in terms of their content. Now we are left with 10 to 12% of our current government school cohort that are able to take on further higher education, and that will ultimately go on to be part of our innovation, Fourth Industrial Revolution, digital economy cohort. So that's where the challenges are. It's not just looking at it from a one-point static moment in time. We actually have to look at the long-term effects that this is having if we don't start to see a movement towards a culture of achievement and we just sit at a culture of pass.
So let's break it down. When we talk about the quality of the pass, what exactly are you referring to?
So the quality of the pass, really at the moment, what it really means, what this 80% has told us, is that 80% of the students who entered into matriculation, not into the formal education system, attended. That's really all it's telling us, that they completed some level of basic education. Because we're not sitting there putting a standard benchmark in, like most countries, actually probably all countries, that 50% is the pass rate. We've lowered that standard, and we are really just saying, congratulations, 80% of you really completed your studies. It does not mean that 80% of our students are now able to go on to be both job ready, higher education ready, even TVET ready. So I think that it's a misnomer. It's misleading us into a complacency that we've really achieve something as a country. Actually, we need to be looking at how do we model those 20 to 40% of students who really achieved, how do we take that to the whole population?
I would imagine the Department of Education would dispute that hotly, and they would say what this means is that 81.3% of the candidates who sat for that National Senior Certificate exam actually achieved some level of competence in the curriculum. So you're saying that is not the case?
I'm saying it's not the case in every account for every individual. I think that I understand why the department needs to have benchmarks like this, because what we're actually trying to do is make our education system more accessible. And when you've got a large population, as South Africa does, and it's heterogeneous, we are not seeing that what happens in one province happens in another. The quality of teachers in different schools is a real challenge for us. So, the department now is trying to ensure that there is access to all students to a education. What I'm now talking about is how do we model quality education, and I don't think that that's so discordant with what the government's trying to do. It's about how we now, both private and public sector, can work together to work out what does that model look like. What does it look like if we want to achieve and not pass?
I'm curious to hear from your perspective what that model looks like, because if we look at the private sector and public sector schooling disciplines, it's chalk and cheese. You can have a situation in a private school setup where you have 20, at most maybe 30 children per class, and in the government, the public sector schooling system, you could have up to 60 children sitting in a matric class. So are we not comparing chalk and cheese? So I want to know what that model looks like from your perspective.
Absolutely. So I think the number one thing that we are not taking on is the professional development of our teachers. Now, even if we started a huge campaign with really meaningful professional development, not basic workshop, digital literacy, surface level professional development, really helping our teachers to do what I believe our teachers want to do, which is to improve themselves so that they can improve the results of our students. I see that every day when I work with teachers. It isn't something that we're pushing against. It's that we say we've got a policy that really supports our teachers. I don't believe we do. And certainly not strong enough to have turned around outcomes for our teachers so that they would turn around educational outcomes for our students. That's the first part.
But are our teachers strong enough, content-wise? Is the content knowledge level of our teachers strong enough to attain what you're advocating for, which is understanding the knowledge that is being taught?
No, probably not. But there is actually, if we start looking outside of South Africa, there is a movement from transforming the role of a teacher, of being a content master, or the sage on the stage, as they call it, to being a learning facilitator. And that's where technology really plays a key role, because content and knowledge can come from anywhere. So it's just about how do we get our teachers to facilitate that in the students. And that actually assists us when we do have classes of 60 and above, because that may not change. That is a long-term systemic challenge that the government's trying to overcome. So if we have a teacher now who's been trained really well in global best practices around how to be a facilitator of learning, we've given students technology but content, then digital education, so that they can help themselves and the teachers can trigger that, we have a much stronger model. And that's ultimately what happens in our private schools and independent schools, is that they're well resourced with teachers who are facilitating and triggering learning to occur. Then they also must make sure that the home school, the piece that is happening at school after school is positive. And I think that's also a challenge for us, because a lot of parents sitting in government schools, they may not understand what do they need to do to assist their child to be able to prepare for matriculation. Whereas a lot of our independent and private schools, they have a much more vested interest and engagement in what's happening in their child's life. So we need to improve three different areas. Professional development of our teachers, making sure our students are well resourced using technology, and then we must make sure that our parents are aware what they need to do to really support their child as they go into these sorts of large examinations.
And I totally agree with you. The problem for me, however, rests with, again, the content knowledge, the content part. Yes, you can teach teachers how to facilitate effectively, but what are we doing to make sure that our teachers, content-wise, are strong enough to deal with children who may, in certain instances, be ahead of the curve?
So I think, again, it comes back to how do we give that level of personalisation that it's very difficult for a teacher who's got 40 or above students. So even if they're a really great content master, how do they deliver that and distribute that in a classroom where they're going to have a disparity of learning abilities? And we are then losing a lot of our innovative, high-performing students in that case. So,
if I may just interject,
sure.
and this is the problem, Dr. Varady. Many of our teachers, unfortunately, are not those content masters, as you point out. Many of the teachers who are teaching would themselves fail miserably if they were to write the papers that these learners are being assessed on.
Absolutely. But are we going to change that purely through workshop-driven professional development? The answer is no. So that's where I think we have to get to a point that the students are more self-directed and more responsible for the content part. That's why I keep saying technology is such an important component, because the technology allows us to deliver and distribute content, knowledge and skills, and develop feedback. So students can get lifetime feedback, which they're not currently getting from either their parents or their teachers. It's really where the student becomes more at the pillar, at the center of this learning model, whereas a teacher now is facilitating the aspects around it. And we've seen even from data over 12 months that children who are given the ability to use technology meaningfully in digital education can improve by 28 to 35%. We did it at IDEA over 12 months in government schools, quintile 1 and 2 schools, where we facilitated a teacher to make sure that they were implementing with the students but not needing to teach content, because the teachers themselves didn't have the content knowledge to be able to do that.
I don't even know what to say to that, because it's shocking, but it's not a new discovery. This has been going on for the longest time. So I suppose perhaps there needs to be some new ways, some innovative ways that you're pointing out to deal with this particular problem. But if we're talking maths and science, the problem is further exacerbated, unfortunately. Where's the solution going to come from in that regard?
In maths and science?
Yes.
I mean, I think the challenges we're facing in maths and science are we're challenged across the board, but it's because of, as you say, content mastery in maths and science is a particular area that we don't seem to be getting a lot of teachers. So languages, social sciences, and often religious studies are the areas that teachers will do their training in. So then that really challenges us because we don't have high-level experts in terms of maths and science. We have to be relying on a global continental approach, which is that there's a lot of good that's happening in countries like Rwanda and Kenya to understand and to accept the realities that they do not have the teacher workforce to be able to deliver some of these subjects. And they're calling on platforms and global technology solutions to come in and help them to raise the bar. Because it really is the only way we're going to see an improvement. And the teachers will improve along that journey as we do it. But I think it goes beyond us understanding. So, the President in February last year said, well, we're going to have one device per child. That is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's about the delivery of computers and laptops. We actually now need to be looking at how do we deliver the soft skills, the really important long-term investment, which is messy and complex, but that's around content to our students and well-resourced students, and then professional development to our teachers. If we did those two things in parallel, I promise you next year we can start seeing our achievement rate increasing from what it is at the moment. And not then one day, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, hopefully, we even remove the concept of pass rate from our vocabulary.
Should we not be incentivizing people to actually gear them towards, taking up maths and science and specializing in those and teaching in those subjects? Can't we find a way to entice them?
It's a huge global challenge. This is not something South Africa is just going through, is that we don't have the numbers of teachers that we need in general, and we certainly don't have the quality of the teachers we need. And it's really hard for us to attract teachers from graduate students. So if you have a top-level empirical sciences graduate coming out, even with a master's degree, they very, very often don't go into teaching and education. And so I'm seeing programs around the world that are trialling this. So, for example, the Teach For programs, which are running in Southeast Asia. What they do is the government actually incentivizes a bursary to pay for all of the university and graduate level courses as long as they come out and do 3 years of teaching in schools to try and hand over to even those teachers who are going to stay as teaching professionals for the rest of their life to hand over some of that content. We do need to try and attract more experts and subject matter experts into teaching, but it is a challenge that the whole world is facing. I mean, on this continent alone, we're talking about roughly 17 million teachers that we do not have to meet the need of the current growing population. So we are going to see this inequity in terms of low-performing schools that are going to have a lower pass rate going forward because we don't have the teachers to meet those needs.
And speaking of inequity, the Minister also touched on the fact that there seems to be a growing divide between the rich and the poor schools. That certainly has to be worrying.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes back to my point that I think we've got two different expectations on top of the fact that we're delivering two different types of education. So I think it's very unfair because at one point you're actually saying we aren't going to deliver the best quality education, but don't worry, it's because we have low expectations of you as students, teachers and schools. And if we don't lift that bar and explain and model what high-level standards are to these schools, then how can we expect our teachers to walk that road to understand what they need to do? Because at the moment in those quintile 1 to 3 schools, we really do say to the schools, it's okay. Just please get to 30-40% and then your students will be doing really well. But would we say that to the schools where they're well-resourced, well-funded, private, or even the upper-level kind of urban government schools? We are telling them and modelling what does success look like. What does it mean that 100% of your students are now going to go on to tertiary? That's what we expect from you. We should expect that from across the board and then try and work with those schools who can't meet that need to move their standards up.
It's such a complicated problem because when you look at, the culture of learning and teaching, and it starts from the minute you set foot on the school premises. If you have children who have to learn in a mud structure, already it speaks to the ethos of the school. It speaks to the level of determination that you're going to get. It speaks to the level of expectation that there will be for that particular school to achieve. The minister sat in that very chair yesterday and she said, we simply don't have the money. Her exact words were, if I had a magic wand, I would wave it and make sure that all of those schools, those mud schools, are eradicated, but I don't. We simply don't have the budget. So in that sense, how then can you realistically expect children from those quintile 1 and 2 schools who have the very least, at their disposal to compete fairly with children who are sitting in air-conditioned classrooms?
Right. I mean, I think that's a big challenge, and it certainly challenges our concept of democracy of education in South Africa, right? And I would agree with the minister. I don't think they do have the money. And I think they're really pushed because we're dealing with multiple urgent crises across the education sector constantly. How do we prioritise, and what parts of it do we prioritise? So I think that the basic essentials of infrastructure in schools needs to improve in a lot of schools. But we do see that even in those schools, and I work in some of the deep rural areas of South Africa, we do see that even though the infrastructure components are not up to scratch, and certainly are not even at a kind of African benchmark from this continent, we do see that if there's a golden teacher there, or if there's a couple of golden teachers there, the students can still perform. They can still access some part of the education. I do think it's going to take us time for us to make sure we've built the essentials and ensured at the same time that we've achieved. So, often I get questioned around how could I be saying that technology is a part of a solution in a country like South Africa, where we do have this situation that there are some resource schools and there are some schools that don't even have classrooms. I don't think that the two are exclusive of one another. We must be modelling and trialling what does our achievement model look like in the schools that are tech-enabled or that are well-resourced. We must make sure that we can prove that on a scalable government level. And there are lots of schools. We're talking thousands of schools that we can get that right. And those thousands of schools are still not performing. So that's what we need to answer as well. At the same time that we need to make sure that we're building the basic essentials for all schools across the country. But if we just put that aside at the moment and say it's not about outcomes, it's not about quality, we're just going to focus on infrastructure of schools and not worry about the quality that we're delivering in our schools, I promise you in 15 years' time, once we get that right and we've built all of our schools, we're going to look back and say, but we as a nation don't have achievers in this country. We cannot risk that.
But the critics would say, if you look at the objective reality of what these two sets of education systems are dealing with, is it even fair to compare them?
No, we can't compare them, but my broader point is if we can try and link back and say, well, the infrastructure component has led to poor results. I think evidence has shown that you can still have very basic infrastructure and deliver results if we can get the professional development and teacher mentorship component right.
But part of the reality is also that if children, and we've seen stories that some of our reporters have done, who don't have a toilet at school, some would even stay away from school, for various reasons due to simple infrastructure problems. That has to have an impact on where they ultimately land up on, where you go to another school where children are walking into this luxurious bathroom, should they need to go to the loo.
Sure. No, I agree with you, but I think what we need to look at is the results of some of those schools, because you're going to find that even in that well-resourced school, that well-infrastructured school, we have drastically poor results. My question is, then, is the correlation around the resourcing of basic infrastructure leading to our educational results? That's not what the Matric pass rate is measuring, right? So there is no doubt that the bare essentials are required for us to ensure that our children have the best welfare to be able to perform. A lot of those students that you're talking about in those poorly infrastructured schools probably drop out very early. That's probably one part of the student engagement model we're not getting right. But there actually has to be parallel purposes. Because if we keep saying that it's just about providing the basics, we're constantly saying then it's about access. This whole model then becomes around how do we deliver something to everybody, no matter what the quality of that something or standards of that something is. Now, what I want to do is have a look at how can we budget and make sure that over the medium to long term, we have ensured that that infrastructure is there, but making sure that even once we've done that and we've resourced these schools, that the quality that we're resourcing them with is also going to make a huge difference to our matriculation. Because otherwise, resourcing these schools, students are listening to this now and saying, well, that's great, but I went to school, I dropped out of school. 60% of our population dropped out of school because they said, you don't understand what the quality is like. You don't understand what it's like to have to sit there when your teacher doesn't know the answer to a question that I don't know the answer to. And so who's going to answer those questions for me?
That's if you do have a teacher, because in certain instances, the teachers don't even show up.
Yeah, absolutely. It happens across the board. But I also think that that is changing. I mean, I really do think that the government is challenged, as we're saying, at polar ends, because here I am saying, come on, we need to drive greater outcomes, high-level outcomes, and we're having a discussion around whether we've even got a school built or a teacher is in the premises. So now, if you're a government, you're sitting there saying, how do I now budget when I've got limited resources to do so? But that's where we have to come back and start saying, so is this pass rate just because people are saying, well, we need some positivity in our country to reward ourselves and celebrate, so is it good enough? And I'm saying, even with all those challenges, and even with us saying we need a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, it's still not a good enough benchmark for us to feel comfortable that we can say as South Africa we're globally competitive. Because at the moment we're not competitive even on the African continent in terms of our standards.
So your word of advice to the class of 2020?
My word of advice to the class of 2020 is please stick at it. So now we are seeing that we've got a developed TVET. So even if you didn't achieve those results to go into tertiary education, make sure that you continue some level of further education, because that's the only way you're going to continue to be job ready for this labour market.
Dr. Corrin Varady, always a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you very
you
much.
so much for stopping by. And as you can hear, you know, the problems are many and they are so complicated. Or we don't call them problems, we call them challenges, and they need to be overcome. But as you heard, there's some great ideas, and it remains to be seen how government actually takes this forward.